Well, one of the results of World War One is that nationalism starts spreading. If you remember that, Wilson's 14-point plan had said, hey, we are going to let nationalism spread. And the Central Power colonies get that. The Allied power colonies do not. And so here we're going to start looking at what happens as those Allied powered colonies want to get more freedom. Alright, so now let's go to India. Indian nationalism is growing throughout, and they've started asking themselves, why did they even fight in the Great War? So one of the things that's getting built there is just India's economy is set up somewhat for export here, and so they got railroads all over the place. So the railroads, first of all, they're sending stuff out of the country, but then also it's sending people and bringing them together. And so the educated elites of India, they had learned Western culture from the beginning. They'd used the values of democracy and individual freedom and equality. They're starting to spread. And when they see Wilson's 14-point plan, they see it's a way for India to get self-determination. And so two groups are going to form out of this, and one is the Indian National Congress, formed in 1885, and one is the Muslim League in 1906. And they both are going to stress at first, hey, we are going to work with the British to get self-rule. But then after World War I, they say, forget it, we're going to do it on our own. The Muslim League was pretty worried about the Indian National Congress because, let's remember, one of the questions whenever you come to India you have to answer is, okay, what's going on with the relationship of Hindus and Muslims? There are way more Hindus than Muslims. So the Muslim League is worried that if the Indian National Congress just gets self-rule, the Hindu side of things, then they're just going to continue to be oppressed by our Hindus instead of the British. The leader of this is Mahatma Gandhi. He's a prosperous Hindu. He's married at 13 and goes to study law in London. Then he goes to South Africa to work with an Indian law firm where he works against Indians being mistreated as second-class citizens in South Africa. And he embraces a moral philosophy that really encourages tolerance and nonviolence and passive resistance based in truth and firmness. He gives up all material possessions and becomes a vegetarian. He studies Hinduism for at least an hour a day. He gives up sex and tests himself by sleeping with younger women. He is seen as a great soul. He is the moral, just truth of Gandhi, of what he provides to the Indians cannot be understated. And what he does is he provides a massive organization that starts to spread Indian nationalism. Before this, it was a bunch of old guys basically fighting, but now he's going to fight against the caste system. He's going to lead a civil disobedience movement. He's going to lead a boycott of British goods throughout, because then his theory is if we don't use British goods, that's going to lead to self-sufficiency for us. Gandhi's message just speaks with the people. The spiritual intensity and political activism is throughout. So again, Gandhi thinks that self-sufficiency is the key, and if you boycott the British goods, and then if you give the money to Indian workers instead, that's going to help. He didn't want India to industrialize, but he wants them to be self-sufficient. The British are going to fight back against this. They get massacred, and you can read the quote here. In 1919, in the Punjab region, Amritsar, just a brutal massacre that is going to take place. But this only increases the desire of the the Indian people to get independence. So this leads to the Indian Act of 1937. The British just cannot put down the rebellion. It starts a bicameral legislature with an executive branch that is shared with the British. And the Hindus are coming out of the Great Depression better than the Muslims. And what this means is that, yes, the Hindus like this, but the princes, those regional powers, and the Muslims don't like this. Then this leads to a new Muslim person who is going to be the key for the Muslims. Gandhi's the key on the Hindu side. The key on the Muslim side is a guy by the name of Muhammad Ali Jinnah. He's the head of the Muslim League. And he taught that a unified India was a threat to Islam, and he wants there to be a two-state solution. That's India. Let's go to China. In China, European influence all over the place. The warlords rule the republic after the Qing have fallen. The Qing have fallen, and those foreign powers are only there to promote economic growth. So in other words, China is all regionalized. The dynasty system is gone. Beijing, the only thing Beijing is doing at this point is running the post office. And everything else, again, is regional. Chinese society goes into huge amounts of disarray because the warlords neglect the irrigation system, and the opium trade grows, and the economic investment by foreign powers in China decreases. Japan, because of that, gets more say in things. And what's going to slowly but surely take place is after World War I, China thought the U.S. would get rid of unequal treaties. Students and other intellectuals in urban areas are calling to get rid of any any imperial power, and some people are really just disillusioned with the West. And you have two parties that start to form. The first one is the Chinese Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong was an early member of that Communist Party. He's a former teacher and librarian. He saw what Lenin was doing in the Soviet Union and thought it was the answer for China. And he believes in a lot of things for women's equality. Divorce, good. No arranged marriages, was against foot binding. And then also on the other side, you have the Nationalist Party. These people are way more on the democracy side of things, the Kuomintang, sorry. 3 principles of the party: no special privileges for foreigners. That should be good. None of the unequal treaty stuff. National reunification, get rid of that regional part. And then economic development through a democratic government. And at first the people are working together. Both parties are being helped by the Soviet Union because they see they should lessen European influence in China, which is something that Lenin and Stalin both wanted. So at first the two parties get along with each other, and then that fails. When Chiang Kai-shek, also known as Chiang Kai-shek, takes over, he's a young general trained in the Japan and USSR. He brings China under the Kuomintang rule. He turned against his communist allies, and he unifies northern China. The Kuomintang becomes the official, sovereign, and unified rulers of China. Now, China had avoided the Great Depression because they were not industrialized, but foreign trade was so little at this point. China is essentially in its own neck of the woods. So you now have, in the north, you have the nationalists, you have a democracy forming. And in the south, you have the Communist Party led by Mao, and they're fleeing the nationalist north. The warlords are still ruling a lot of the rural parts. Communism is going to start to grow because as you move further and further south, the peasants see some of the advantage of it for them. And with Japan being more and more aggressive in the 1930s, Chiang Kai-shek decides, hey, and by the way, Chiang Kai-shek, same person. And Jaish decides, instead of going down to the instead of dealing with the Japanese, we're going to try to get rid of the communists. And so, as the Japanese get more and more aggressive in northern China, the nationalists move further and further south. And what happens is, Chiang Jaish, and I'll show you here on this map, Chiang Jaish, as he's chasing down Mao, they go on what is known as the Great March. They go on the Great March, and they're going to avoid the army of the nationalists, and they escape, going on over 10,000 kilometer journey, and they're going to set up a new headquarters in rural China. And this inspires the Chinese. This inspires the Chinese even more. And by this time, Mao is the leader, and Mao believes in the power of the villages. That Mao's take on communism is that the peasants, rather than that urban proletariat, would be the foundation. In other words, that the rural people would be the power. So let's think about this. You start with basics of Marx's basic theories. Hey, the proletariat will rise up and you'll form a government. You won't need a government. Leninism takes that and goes, no, you need a good leader. Mao says, no, the peasants are the key to the revolution, not the urban proletariats. And so that's going to become key after Mao is going to take over. One more group here to talk about in Asia, and that is the Japanese. They're one of the big powers coming out of World War I, as they had agreed, but they had agreed to a limited naval development, and they're going to leave China alone. They sign what's the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which renounces war as an instrument of nationalism. There are tons of economic success at first, but however, rapid inflation and labor problems are going to lead to economic problems, and then the Great Depression, since they are fully integrated into the Western economy, is going to kill industrial production, trade, and they have financial chaos running throughout. This is now where you are going to have calls from are calls for reform that are going to be blocked by the conservatives. Conservatives only let male universal suffrage pass in 1925. You have significant economic problems in the 1930s, and right-wing groups are calling for an end to party rule. They're going xenophobic, nationalists, want to preserve Japanese culture, and eventually they are going to assassinate the prime minister in 1932. However, before this, they are going to go into China, into Manchuria, the home of the Qing, and Japanese troops blow up a part of the railroad in the Chinese town of Murgden. It's kind of like Martin with a just different start of the pronunciation, and they accuse the Chinese of it. In other words, the Japanese are accusing the Chinese. The Chinese are accusing the Japanese of blowing up a part of their railroad. That works, and because now they accuse the Chinese, and now they can go in, and Japan will establish a puppet government in Manchuria. When Chiang Kai-shek applies to the League of Nations, and they say, Japan, you need to give this up. Why? Because that's Chinese territory, and you had already guaranteed you would not use war as an instrument of nationalism. They say, stop us. And so Japan just says, hey, we're going to leave the League of Nations. All right, so let's realize where we are here at the end of this. Oops. In India, you have limited self-rule, but the British are definitely still there. When you have the Indian National Congress, which are the Hindus, and the Muslim League, which are the Muslims, fighting on each side of things. Indian National Congress wants a unified India. Muslim League wants a two-state solution. In China, after the Qing are gone, the rural warlords are ruling the area. You have two major political parties formed. You have the Chinese Communist Party, you have the Kuomintang Party, and they both have their separate beliefs. Mao with the communists, Kuomintang are more democracy. Kuomintang rule after backstabbing the communists. Then as the nationalists move further and further south to try to knock out the communists, the Long March to avoid the nationalist army, and the peasants at that point then are going more and more towards Mao. And lastly, Japan. Japan is going to move into China more with Manchuria. They're going to move into Manchuria, and Japan is going to get more and more xenophobic and nationalistic during this time period, and they have started to try to work to conquer parts of Asia.